some other items of concern, I think that we need to discuss that may increase the value of the project. But certainly, I wanted to get all the committees together because I think we need to give not only the general public an update, but we need to inform the board and maybe have a public hearing before the Board of Selectmen where the public can be recognized. This meeting tonight, the participants will only, the committee participants are the only ones that are allowed to participate. They'll be recognized by the moderator. But we are going to give the general public an opportunity at a later date to discuss the project. Also, we need to make a determination if we're going to move this project forward. And the only ones that can send it forward is the Board of Selectmen. So certainly, I think that is something that they need to consider. I think the information that's being provided to them tonight is going to help them make that decision. So with that, I'll turn it over to the moderator, and we'll follow the agenda item as presented.
Thank you, Ed. So we start off with a presentation by Tecton Architects, Public Safety Facility Project. That's you. And you're going to do it here?
Yep.
Okay, fine.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight to talk about the public safety feasibility study that we have conducted over the past 4 or 5 years now with the town of Auburn. For those who don't know me, I know a few of the faces here in the crowd, but for those that don't, my name is Matt Salad. I'm a project manager and associate with Tecton Architects out of Hartford, Connecticut. A little background on me and our firm. We're a multidisciplinary architecture firm that handles healthcare, public safety, education, K through 12 and higher education. My design studio focuses explicitly on public safety design. These are highly specialized facilities, and they require quite a bit of rigor in terms of successful execution for these types of projects. We're happy to be here tonight to present the results of this feasibility study with you all. I've got a number of slides and a number of different topics that are going to take you through the entire process from the beginning of the feasibility study to now. And I do encourage any questions or comments that you may have along the way. Please feel free to raise your hand and let me know if you'd like me to elaborate or discuss anything further on anything. So I'd like this to be slightly conversational if anything does come up. So the task that we had been given by the town of Auburn was to go through a series of different items in order to really determine the suitability of the existing facilities for both fire stations in town and the police station, identify any deficiencies that the buildings may have, and whether or not they're suitable for renovation, addition, or reuse, or if they've sort of outlived their intended purpose for the town. So that started with a space needs assessment. Then we worked closely with both fire and police departments to develop what's called a program. This is a detailed set of spaces and everything that goes into those spaces to essentially form the framework for what will become the buildings themselves. This is accompanied by square footages, as well as some technology, security, infrastructure type components. They all go into a large document, and that's what sort of generates the basis for the rest of the study itself. We then did further detailed site and building evaluations, looking at ways that we can renovate them, add on to them, and again, whether or not they're suitable for continued use and operation. We then did a very lengthy site capacity evaluation, not only for the existing sites that both fire stations and police station occupy, but also other properties within town that met specific criteria that would accommodate the fire and police departments themselves. So we sort of looked at this with a real broad brush to see, if these sites really don't support the future needs of the departments in the town, where else in town could these go? And are those town-owned or are they privately owned and so forth? So I'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Through those, we narrowed the project down to really 2 sites that would be applicable for this project as it bore out, and then did early schematic designs for both of those sites, and then ultimately made a determination for one site in particular, which we have further developed, which are on the boards behind you in the room, and then there's some updated graphics that we'll go through in the presentation as well. When I go through those, the floor plans, they're drawings this big, so projected on the screen, they're going to be a little hard to see. So I'm going to pull up a PDF, and we can zoom in the spaces and look at them in a little bit more detail so you get a better sense of the interior architecture that we're trying to create. From the compilation of all those different documents and phases, we were then able to put together an opinion of probable cost, and then ultimately a detailed cost estimate that was pulled into a full project budget, and we'll discuss what those numbers are now. I say opinion of probable cost and cost estimate because we did do an opinion of probable cost, which is a high-level analysis of what the project might cost several years ago, prior to COVID. I'll give a little bit of a history on construction cost escalation since the onset of COVID to now, and how that further affected the cost estimate as it stands today. So the project timeline that we've gone through so far, in 2018, the town of Auburn hired us to conduct the feasibility study. That was sometime in October, I believe it was. We began going through the programming exercise and understanding what the actual space needs of each department are at that time. And then early in 2019, we completed the building evaluations as well as the programs, and that's when we generated our initial opinions of probable cost. We also, later that spring and early summer, began the site selection and test fit process, looking at the 3 existing sites for Station 2, Fire Headquarters, and the police station, as well as others within the core downtown area of the town of Auburn. And in that same year in the summer, we also held an open house at all 3 facilities so that the public can be invited in, take a detailed tour of each facility, and really understand what the issues and problems with each are firsthand. As this was ongoing, we also provided an alternate opinion of probable cost that would consolidate down one of the fire headquarters and the police station into a single combined facility. When you do that, there's some overlapping spaces, components, equipment, and maintenance that go into creating a much more efficient building over the life cycle cost of that facility. It's certainly more expensive as an upfront cost to construct, design, and build it as a single facility, but ultimately, the entire life cycle cost of it and building separate buildings, it has some inherent value to it in reduction in cost, and we do provide some data on what that means. At the end of the site selection process, we determined that if we were to go forward with a combined public safety facility, it was very challenged on the existing sites that you have now. And the site selection and test fit process through other properties in the center of town showed that there were a few properties that might be more fruitful and more beneficial to the continued use of these buildings. So the town conducted 2 separate requests for proposals to purchase and acquire property that would then be used for the public safety facility itself. That took about a year and a half, something like that, to assemble the RFPs, put them on the street, receive proposals. Neither of those RFPs provided any successful properties for acquisition. That was concluded in early 2022. That time frame was certainly stretched because of COVID, as many other things were at the time. And then later in 2022, it was determined that the existing, this is sort of the alternate site that we were looking at in terms of what you have now, was looking at West Street, where the fire station number 2 currently is, and can we put a public safety facility on that? It was deemed feasible and viable, and we then proceeded into schematic design late last winter up until now, and that brings us where we are currently. So I just want to give a brief overview of the existing facilities and their conditions. I'm sure we're all aware of some of the deficiencies that each of the buildings may have. So Three properties, police headquarters on Oxford Street. It's sort of a challenged site, as you can see in this diagram on the left. It's sort of this really narrow crescent-shaped site. It has a hill, a steep slope off to the back away from Oxford Street, and is sort of dead-ended by wetlands on either side. The site as it stands now is sort of at its maximum capacity. There's no room for real expansion there. And that's a real hindrance for the police department, which is currently at or over capacity for that facility. Fire headquarters, just across the street here. You can see that sort of big blue blob, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit further as we go on. But we're sort of prohibited from making any real additions or major renovations to that property, into that site, because that area that's highlighted there is an actual designated FEMA floodway. So any major renovations or things that would further impede that floodway spillover area would actually have the potential for a reduction or elimination of town's eligibility for FEMA grants if there is a natural disaster in town, and we certainly want to avoid that. And then fire station number 2 on West Street. So as I had mentioned with the police station and your emergency communications dispatch center on Oxford Street, a lot of the deficiencies with this facility are really about the size of the building and the size of the property. Those are some of the major challenges, in addition to the actual building itself as a suitable facility for a police station. Now, this was constructed in 2000, so it's not an old building by any stretch of the imagination. When we design police stations and fire stations, they really should last for 50-plus years. These are major capital investments in a community. Unfortunately, the way that it was designed as it was at capacity the day that it opened. And the department has since grown significantly since that building was opened. In 1991, probably at the early, it takes about 10 years to construct these buildings from the initial onset of a feasibility study through construction. At that time, the staff was only about 15 officers, 15 staff in the building, and 1 dispatcher. Now they have 3 dispatchers and a dispatch supervisor position in a space that can really only adequately fit 2. And they now have approximately 50 staff, Chief. Is that an accurate number, around 50?
41 sworn, then we have an additional 11 dispatchers and 5 administrative personnel.
So that's almost 3.5 times the staff that there was in 1991. And continuing to grow, we're seeing staffing increases in public safety agencies around the country increasing significantly over the past 10 years. Because of increased demand and changes in the way that policing is conducted nowadays. There's also been a lot of technology changes. Police stations that were built in 2000, between 1990 and 2000, this isn't an Auburn problem. This is sort of a global problem of these facilities. They were really constructed at a time when technology was really changing, and even more so in police departments and in emergency communication centers. So they didn't have the ability to see the future and sort of understand how much of this is going to be impacting future facilities, and weren't able to build in the flexibility for future growth. And so right now, if you walk through that facility, you'll notice that sort of every space is too small. Everything's sort of over-occupied. There's more officers in each office space than can support it. There's also functional deficiencies for a police facility. These are just a couple of photos of it, of the building themselves. The one on the top right in particular, this is the Sally Port. So this is a secure garage bay within the building, and this is where detainees are brought in for processing once they've been arrested for committing a crime. This was built essentially as a residential garage, and that's not adequate for the type of use for this facility. It's also their main storage space in the garage. These really need to be clean, separate areas for the successful and safe transfer of a detainee into the building to be processed. And here you've got motorcycles, gear, columns, things like that, something that somebody who's combative can grab a hold of and make a dangerous situation for the arresting officer. They're also residential-sized overhead doors, and there's no room to really make them bigger because the floor-to-floor height of the building isn't adequate to really enlarge these. these spaces need to be designed to get an ambulance in and out. If you've arrested somebody, the first 24 hours of that arrest are the highest probability for somebody to commit self-harm. So suicide prevention and risk prevention in a lockup facility is one of the most crucial parts of that custodial responsibility of your police department. And if somebody has a medical emergency or fakes a medical emergency and you aren't able to get an ambulance into the bays to actually get them treated securely and out to a hospital, you might have a real safety issue where that person might become combative again on that transfer and have an opportunity to escape out into the public or harm an officer or an emergency responder. Fire department, this is a chart from 2012 through 2022 showing the increase in call volume year over year. Since 2012, it's roughly 40% of an increase in call volume. More calls, more staff, more apparatus, more ambulances. These are things that increase and need space to be stored within these facilities. If you need a new fire truck or a ladder or an ambulance that goes into them, something else needs to move outside. Just like the building, these fire apparatus are significant capital investments that the community makes, and we want to make sure that they're protected. So the fire headquarters, as I mentioned, one of the major concerns with this facility here is that it is indeed in a FEMA floodway, and we don't want to make any additions or major renovations to it that would disqualify the town from any FEMA funding in the future. It's also a really challenging site located, right on that corner of Southbridge and Auburn Street. It's difficult to respond, and it's also very, very shallow in what's called its apron depth. That's the depth from the overhead doors to the street. There's a minimum of at least 50 feet required just to get the trucks out onto the apron and then able to maneuver out onto the actual street safely, and there's not enough depth for that. It was also constructed at a time when fire trucks were certainly a lot different. The image on the left is from when the original building was constructed, and you can see how much smaller those vehicles are than the modern apparatus are today. The image on the bottom right is also something that's rather concerning. As the trucks get larger and taller, they also get a lot wider. There's more equipment that needs to be on them in order to respond. And as they get tighter and tighter in space, you can see there's only inches or feet, and we've all parked in a tight spot in a parking lot and had to struggle to get in and out of a vehicle. You can imagine what it's like when you're racing to get to that engine to respond to an emergency and how much time that could take. Not to mention it creates a blind spot for the driver of the apparatus, and that creates a serious health hazard to any other firefighters trying to get onto that rig, because anybody that's trying to get out in an emergency quickly and isn't able to see somebody that's close by in that tight space could be in real harm. There's also no real ADA accessibility in that building either. There's no elevator. Most of the staff facilities are up on the second floor. And so if there's ever an injured officer or somebody that is working on with a disability, they're not able to actually engage in all the spaces adequately with the rest of the staff. And that smaller stair there is also the steps up to the pole that gets down into the apparatus space. So not only are you already having to go down a fire pole to get onto the floor to respond, but you're having to race upstairs in order to get to that pole and get down. So it creates a real tripping hazard for anybody that's responding, and the last thing you want when you're on the other end of that 911 call is for the firefighters and first responders to be responding to you to get injured on the way. Station number 2 on West Street. This site is a little bit more gracious. There's quite a bit more room on it, but it is a shared building, so that is a challenge. But this is a converted elementary school that's been turned into a fire station. And like I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these facilities are very specifically designed for their intended use. A fire truck does not weigh the same as school children do that are in a cafeteria. And so there's real structural issues and concerns with having apparatus that are out on a concrete slab that isn't designed for them. Additionally, fire station number 2, as well as headquarters, both have similar health and safety issues with the fire staff. The past 30 years have taught us a lot of lessons on first responder health and safety in a fire station and the carcinogens that are in the apparatus bays. They have a higher rate of cancer because of this, and so creating true proper separations between what we call hot and cold zones, and that's your fire apparatus bays and the rest of the living quarters, separating those air environments completely so that the fire staff, when they're in the building doing their work, are doing so in a safe manner. That's not possible in these two buildings as they stand right now. So they're making do as best they can, but there are real concerns about that. And again, similar deficiencies as headquarters does. Not enough space between the trucks, inadequate office space, and it's just an old, tired, dated building that just really does not serve the intended purpose that it was meant for. So I'm going to touch briefly on programming and how we go through that process and how we came up with why these buildings need to be the size that they are. This is a number of different things we look at when we go through project goals and visioning and putting together these programs. It's not just, hey, chief, how many offices do you need? It's how does your department perform? How does it want to perform in the future? And how does it want to interact with its greater community? And what sort of community spaces might enhance that as well? We always talk about health and safety. How is this building going to be adaptable? You know, how is it going to grow in the future? We want to make sure that in 20, 30 years, if there's some major spike in population in town, in staff and growth in these departments, that the building can adequately accommodate those changes. Officer training, both for fire and police staff. With police reform right now and things that are going on in the communities around the country, training is one of the #1 requests that we hear from the communities to the police departments and fire departments, as well as from them as well. So right now, none of these buildings have any real training facilities except for station number 2, which has the separate training tower alongside of it. But actual building infrastructure, training spaces, officer training spaces, they just don't exist. There's nowhere for that to occur. And there's a lot of different spaces that sort of make up that. So when we write a program, we go through and interview a number of the staff, a number of the folks, and talk to them about what their real needs are. You know, what are the challenges that you face today? What have you seen in other departments around the Commonwealth? What have you seen around other states? We provide insight on that as well about what new trends are out there in public safety. And we generate a number of spaces, lists, needs, things like that. And it generates down into 3 separate documents. The first one being the site needs assessment. This says, based on the building size and the building type, this is how much site you need, how many acres you need, how many parking spaces you need, things like that. So this really takes from the building out and tells us these are all the components that we need to make sure are addressed within that property. And it helps lead us into the feasibility and applicability of each site in property. We then have a space needs assessment, and this is sort of a bulleted summary of all the different spaces that go into each of the buildings. And these are grouped into different sort of categories. This example here is from the police station itself. Public spaces, training spaces, the dispatch center, things like that, and they're sort of grouped into blocks that help us as we start to get into the actual plans. And then the detailed space requirements. So this is all of the different components that go into every single room that goes within the building. What it needs to have for security, what sort of furniture goes in there, what sort of built-in millwork components are in there, plumbing, mechanical, things like that, so that when we go and design the building, it's already been vetted by all the departments of exactly what needs to go into there, so we can have a really complete and detailed package. And what we generated from that was 3 programs, one for fire headquarters, one for station number 2, and one for the police station. And these are approximately the gross square footages that were generated from each of those. Fire headquarters at around just under 25,000 square feet, just under 12,000 square feet for fire station number 2, and just over 30,000 square feet for the current police station. These are quite a bit larger than the existing facilities now, but these weren't just shots in the dark or generated by anyone other than the data that we had generated through these interviews and programming process. And then we also worked with both departments to say, what if we did a combined facility and took one of the fire stations offline and put it with the police department? moved a bunch of the services from one of the other stations into that, so that all fire administration and an entire response grouping were housed with the police department. What would that building size look like? And it was right around 55,000 square feet. This was in 2019 or 2018 when we had put this together. So we presented that to the Public Safety Feasibility Study Building Committee, and we talked about the pros and cons of the combined facility versus 3 separate facilities. Because at the time we were talking about every single facility has major issues and needs replacement pretty soon. And at the time, the cost for 3 standalone facilities was around $50 million. But because of the overlapping spaces and equipment and the reduced number of maintained systems, that actually generated a combined public safety facility that resulted in a net reduction in project cost of $10.5 million for that project, which is about 20% of the entire cost. So upon review of the program, the building committee agreed that the most suitable way to move forward and most economic way to move forward was to go with the combined public safety facility because of that reduction in cost for shared spaces and the like. The optimization of shared spaces, building systems, and they were able to simultaneously address each department's need. If we replace each building as a standalone facility, you don't really do that all 3 of them at the same time. It'd be too much of a disruption for the public safety service to the community, and it'd have a pretty hefty cost. So they sort of would go one after another, and that long duration of time, again with construction cost escalation, would start to continue to increase the costs over time. So really the most cost-effective solution then was the single public safety facility. So we engaged in a site selection process once the program was determined. We're looking at 3 major criteria for this process. Core criteria, which is whether or not the project itself has suitable topography, subsurface strata, geotechnical data. What are the acquisition logistics for it? Is it a municipal-owned parcel, or is it something that requires an acquisition? And environmental concerns, wetlands, floodways, hazardous materials, things like that may be present on site. The second component is public safety criteria. This is access, right? A public safety facility prefers 2 main ways to get on and off the site, so that way if there's an issue at one of those egress points and there's an emergency they need to respond to, they've got another way off. Does it have enough room for parking, growth, and is it resilient, right? If we're building in a floodway or near a wetland, how is that going to change in the next 20, 30, 40 years with climate change as water courses rise? We want to make sure that we're not going to be underwater in 30 years and you're going to have a reduced response because of resiliency issue of that. And then the town criteria, how it relates to the community, to the context, how does it engage the public? So we started by looking at the 3 existing properties, and again, as I noted, the main environmental impact between the 3 sites currently is that FEMA floodway for current fire headquarters. And we did a number of test fits and landed ultimately on just several key sites that we were looking at. One being Drury Square as a potential acquisition. There were some challenges with this site. Its response off-site was okay, but you sort of have to make that tight curve and then get up the hill. And it didn't allow for a lot of room for expansion, so it was a pretty tight property. It's really close to the high school, and it ultimately wasn't really adequate. We also looked at the Sears Auto property as part of the Auburn Mall. It provided adequate room for growth. It provided enough room to fit the property. But again, that blue stripe that's going through the screen there, that's Stark Brook that runs down past fire headquarters. And that's also part of that FEMA floodway. And it basically, if there's ever a heavy rain event or that water level increases, would cut off the public safety facility from accessing Southbridge Street. And also, it's owned by the mall. So, you know, we're making an assumption on this diagram of how much we would acquire for property, but that was an unanswered question that we really couldn't determine. We went down Southbridge Street a little bit to the Lowe's Yankee Drummer property, right by the Mass Pike on-ramp. Large parcel of land was previously occupied. Good topography, acceptable topography, and plenty of room for growth, and really suited all the needs of both departments for one public safety facility. We were also making sure that these sites were located within a specific radius within the center of town, so that we weren't impacting, by changing the location of the fire department, we're changing its response time out to the community. And so every time we looked at a property, the deputy chief went out, ran response time analysis, and made sure that we were not increasing the response time with any of these preferred properties. And this one actually did not do that. So this sort of ticked all the boxes, so to speak, except for it not being a municipal-owned parcel. And then the last one, we further expanded on West Street as a viable municipal-owned property as well. It has some wetlands impacts that are just to the south, but we're pretty confident they're well out of the area of influence that the project will take. And we looked at this in two ways. One is only a municipal-owned project, and one as a partial acquisition to gain more future growth, as well as move the actual building itself closer to Southbridge Street and away from the existing building. This does a couple things for us. One, it gets us better response directly off the site. And two, it allows station number 2 in that entire facility to basically maintain operations throughout the entire construction. So there would be no impact to the other building. But that would require that acquisition, and that has not come to fruition. So altogether, we studied a lot of properties through town. We did these pretty quickly in heavy detail, and we performed over 24 test fits on a dozen different sites that were within that response time radius that we had identified, and evaluated them across criteria including impact to current operations, response times, the cost of construction, neighborhood impacts, future growth opportunities for the departments, any environmental concerns, impacts to undisturbed and underdeveloped land, as well as acquisition costs. Ultimately, from that, we honed in on 2 properties, the Lowe's Yankee Drummer site and the West Street site to move forward with, which is where we moved into the request for proposals for an acquisition of real property. So the Lowe's site was considered the best site because it didn't disrupt any current operations during construction. But it did require an acquisition, and so we took that as the preferred while the request for proposals was out on the streets, and also moved forward with West Street as an alternate site as sort of plan B if we weren't able to acquire a property. And there's the summary for that. Since we didn't acquire the Lowe's Yankee Drummer site, we moved forward into schematic design this year with West Street, and I'll walk you through the main facility design now. So looking at the existing building as it stands on the property, there are a few challenges with this site. In particular, it's really the coordination with the middle school, its site, any pickup, drop-off, queuing, anything that's going to be going on with the middle school during construction is certainly going to be a challenge, and it's going to be something we're going to work really closely, should this project move forward, with the school department and school board on ensuring that disruptions are limited to the greatest extent possible, if not avoided entirely. And then the 2 options that we had initially presented, the one here that faces West Street, which requires no additional acquisition, and then the one that had a partial land acquisition off to the south. Ultimately, because no acquisitions were realized, we moved forward with option 1, which is this proposal here, which are also on the boards behind you. I'm going to now switch the PowerPoint off and go to a PDF so I can zoom in, because I can't even see that. So this is the proposed site plan. West Street is running here. You can see the middle school back here. The way the site is essentially oriented is similar to how it is now with the fire station here. You can see a small dash line here and here. That's the existing building, and if you notice, this of a modern apparatus bay to adequately house all the vehicles, get them in and allow maneuverability space for the first responders. So we would have up to the north here, sort of just below where the training tower is now, staff parking for fire administration and first responders. This is the exiting apron out onto West Street, and then there's also a return apron into the bays. So they're double-sided drive-through bays, so there would be a separate response and return route. Public parking would be here to the south, and then police staff parking would be off to the rear. And then your public entry would be right down here. Zoom in here on the ground floor. Predominantly, what we're trying to keep is first response, fire, emergency response spaces on the ground floor, so that the quickest to respond, as well as public interfacing spaces down on the lower level. So as you come into the entryway here, there's a walk-off triage room. So if anybody has a medical emergency and is near the station, they can drive right into the parking lot and receive first emergency medical treatment right here in the station. There's a few public interview rooms for going in and applying for your firearms license, which happens in the police station, or to make a citizen complaint, or to speak to an officer about something that's going on in your community. This is where that happens. There's a large lobby here, dispatch center with a reception desk, records clerk office, and then firearms licensing room. A few public restrooms, and then a large training room that will be both, this seats 100 people as a single room, and it can also be subdivided into two separate meeting rooms for use of training by the police staff, fire staff, and also utilized by the public as well. So this is a community amenity, not just one that's for the public safety facility. Off to the back here, around the apparatus bays, these are firematic and decontamination support spaces. And then as we go around to the back of the ground level, this is where our predominant prisoner processing and evidence processing area spaces are. So as you come around to the back of the station, there's the sally port, a dedicated separate sally port from any other garage bay functions, which leads right into the detention area, and is backed up by evidence, so that there's a solid chain of custody for any evidence that's entering the building. And then we also have a vehicle processing and maintenance bay here as well for maintaining fleet vehicles and also processing vehicles that were involved in accidents for evidence. Moving up to the upper floor, the second floor, these are the administrative spaces, and it's sort of fire administration on one, police administration on the other. So fire administration would be here, located approximate to the fire apparatus bays, with response poles here. And these are basically chief's offices, fire prevention, EMS coordination, things like that. So these are all the office functions of the fire department. Conversely, on the opposite side are the staff facilities for the police department. Report preparation, roll call spaces, meeting spaces, locker facilities with modern lockers that are properly sized for all the police gear that would be stored in those. And then the chief's office. We also have mental health support facilities, break room, and the detective squad off to the back here. On the top floor, these are the, we have a small third floor here, and then this is essentially the firefighters' living quarters. So they have their day room, kitchen, dining room, living space. You know, they're on for a 24-hour shift, and in inclement weather, even longer, so they need those full amenities to be there 24/7. And then bunk rooms. So we've got a series of private bunk rooms, officer bunk rooms, and then they have their staff lockers here as well. And then lastly, we do have a small basement associated with this underneath sort of where the training room is. This is really about expanding departmental training and doing that across both fire and police and bringing them together so that they're able to do joint training. So they have a fitness center. We've got a number of storage components in here, and then we also have what's called a firearms training simulator. This is a room that'll be used for defensive tactics, and it's also a simulator space, not with projectors and screens, firearms training simulator is a little deceiving. It's really about de-escalation tactics. So these are real live scenarios under an instructor where you're interacting with a virtual environment to make sure that you're working down a situation and not having a more aggressive tact that departments had in the past. So this is really about giving real-time, consistent training to the officers to make sure that they're really providing the town of Auburn with the best service. And then, go back to the PowerPoint for these. And then what is it gonna look like? We've updated the renderings a little bit since the ones in the back of the room. So this is what we're conceptually proposing for the architecture itself. This is looking at the main entry here from West Street, and this is the outside of the training room. So it's a series of brick on the lower levels and metal panel above with quite a bit of glass. We can detail and design the glass in a way that makes it safe for the officers, as well as giving them a lot of natural light and transparency from the public into the department. It's a big topic of contention around public safety facilities. There are a couple of spots on the roof here and also behind this space where we have a little extra roof space that doesn't need mechanical equipment or solar panels, and we're able to give some elevated outdoor space to the fire and police officers so that they have some outdoor amenities that are safe and protected. And those are also going to be designed so that they can be enclosed in the future and used as future expansion space. So as the department grows, these areas will be able to adapt for the growing needs of the department and be fit out for space at a much lower cost than a new facility. And this is as we get a little bit closer to the main entry, and then from the main entry itself. Couple of exterior elevations of those two facades. And I'll just touch quickly on the budget. So one of the major topics about budget right now is on construction cost escalation. We have seen unprecedented escalation in construction costs. I know everybody's aware of what inflation has been doing since the beginning of COVID. It's hit the construction market much more significantly, where we're seeing 8-9% of inflation year over year over the past couple of years. Construction has been around 20 to 30% year over year. Some of that is driven by wages in the labor and the workforce, but the reality is that through COVID, a lot of manufacturing shut down for a few years. Construction never slowed. So we've created a major backlog in all of the durable goods that need to go into a new construction. And because of that, schedules have increased, costs have increased significantly, and they're continuing to increase. We sort of we sort of thought we were at the tail end of it in 2001, and we were starting to see construction level out. But then gas prices started to increase, and further supply chain shortages started to exacerbate, and so construction costs are continuing to climb month over month and year over year at a pretty accelerated rate. Unfortunately, construction never retracts the cost, so there will never be a less expensive time to build than today, unfortunately. It'll continue to go up. It might go up at a slower rate, but it will inevitably always go up and has done so decade over decade. When we talk about the project costs, we talk about it in three components: construction costs, soft costs, and contingencies. Construction costs are the hard costs, what it takes to get the actual building built. Soft costs are furniture. Yes, sir.
Just while you're on costs, I'm curious with construction, if the supply chain does catch up and construction does level off, wouldn't the supplies be there so the rate to purchase could come down a little bit? I mean, overall, I understand the inflation and the extended costs, but if we can move that gap closer, I think it could free up the cost of materials and make them more readily available.
I wish that was the case. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the way that it's going right now. We've seen components free up over the past couple of years, while other ones have continued to slow down. So it's sort of a revolving door of, this month this material is no longer available. Next month something else may not be available, and so that sort of ping-ponging of availability has continued to create that increase. And as things have come back down and been more reasonable, one example of that is structural steel. About 2 years ago, there was a lot of Amazon warehouses being built in the Northeast, and so certain structural steel components you couldn't buy anymore, right? So those have started to come back, but their prices haven't come back down to the levels that we would have expected them to. Yes. Yep, sorry about that.
Do you know what construction costs looked like in 2008 or thereafter when the housing market crashed and everything? Did they go down?
Excuse me, could you identify yourself and who you represent?
All right.
Yeah, I'm Steve Chambers. I'm on the select board.
Good, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question because it's sort of a similar economic situation that we were in there, where we were sort of coming into and then quickly coming out of a pretty substantial recession. And one might assume that during a pretty big recession like that construction costs would go down. People weren't building, we weren't designing, people were getting laid off left and right. We saw at the lowest point of the recession, we saw 1 year of retraction, and it was 1%. During the other years throughout the recession, construction cost escalation outpaced inflation every single year.
For the record, I'm Patrick Jones, Finance Committee.
Oh, thank you.
So I'll go through this real quick, because I rambled on way too long, and I apologize for that. There's a lot to cover here. So on construction costs, we have three major components. One is construction costs, which is what does it take to get the building built. General contractors, overhead profit, the sticks and bricks, so to speak. Soft costs are professional fees, furniture, fixtures, equipment, all the loose stuff that goes into it, testing, inspections, and then finally contingency. We've got a few contingencies. One, at this phase in a project, design and estimating, because we don't ultimately know every detail that's going to go into the project, so we carry contingency to make up that gap. Owner's contingency, so this is as we get into construction, these are the things that pay for change orders, unforeseen conditions, and project development contingency. This is a contingency for those soft costs. Maybe you found some sort of hazardous material in the soil and you need some more testing or something like that. So the hard cost for the combined public safety facility that was presented today it's a little bit larger than the initial building that was shown in 2019. This has to do with site inefficiency in a way. You saw that L-shaped building and it being 4 floors, that adds more flights of stairs, things like that. Sorry, just getting a little feedback. And construction costs, as I had mentioned, have been escalating 20 to 30% per year. So that hard number right now, as it stands on this, is $64,317,000. And then we include on top of that a 5% construction contingency. That's sort of the industry standard for what an owner should carry for contingency in a new construction project. And then we add in the soft costs, the fees, furniture, OPM fees. This is also increased from the initial costs 3 years ago. And some of that is related to the site. And we now know the site is there. We know that the existing building has some hazardous materials in there. So we did include numbers for demolition costs, abatement, and things like that. And that brings the total opinion of probable cost to just over $78 million for the project. But as I had said, over doing individual facilities, we did have that 20%. We do have that 20% savings instead of doing each one as an individual facility. So there is still real savings to be had with a combined public safety facility, and at 20%, that's about $15.5 million. So there is real value still, even though the sticker price is quite high. That's all I have.
Thank you.
That's it.
Okay.
Any questions or
Anybody else?
comments?
Yes, Ben.
So the 15,678,000, that would just be a savings as opposed to going out new, not operation reduction or costs associated with that.
Just in the construction alone, yeah.
Okay, but there's really no savings if we do none of them, right? It's just if you had 3 separate projects.
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Hi, Megan McCrillis, School Committee. You had mentioned that one of the drawbacks to Drury Square was it was really close to the high school, but the new site that you're proposing is really close to the middle school. Can you just explain the difference, why it's okay in the other site?
Yep.
Thanks.
Let me get back to that site plan. So when we were looking at the Drury Square site, I mean, there's essentially, as we're looking at the back of the high school over here, there's a drive lane and a fence. And then with the proposed design for that, there'd be, on the other side of the fence, a drive lane that apparatus are coming in and out of, and then the building. So we're talking about a setback of maybe 100 feet between the two. With this location, we're down the hill, and we're several hundred feet away from the building, so the actual ability, you know, there's a much larger separation between the two facilities here.
We have a field for the high school, so you're saying you'd be closer to the field, not the building, right?
No, because it was sort of to the north of the site, so it was more or less in line with the high school building itself.
Yes, Chief.
Todd Lemon, Chief of Police. So another component to that is that they didn't want to sell the property that was Shaw's property.
Oh,
And so-
Shaw's, I'm thinking the other side.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
it
yeah.
was the property on Shaw's with Bed Bath & Beyond is. And that was the difficulty that we ran into when it went out for RFP, that nobody was interested in selling us the property.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, we would have, I've seen some public comments, in a perfect world, we'd have got the Lowe's property, and it would probably have met the town's needs for years, whether it be future municipal buildings, DPW, the town hall, whatever it may be. That was, in a perfect world, we would have got that, but the property owner didn't want to sell it. We would have been, and this dates back to when Julie was in office, and Julie and Ed and Steve and myself and the former police chief met. That was what we struggled with. Auburn is very land poor. There's not a lot of land to build these facilities. And it went out to RFP twice, Steve? Went out for RFP twice, and the people are holding on to their property because they think it has a lot of value. And if we went down the road of trying to acquire it through the courts, it would have been extremely costly for the town. It would have gone on for years. So I know the number is no bargain, and so does the fire chief, but the other cost savings is that it's on land that's currently owned by the town of Auburn.
Yes.
Patrick Jones, Finance Committee. I noticed the price tag here is about $80 million, and I get the 20% if we do it all at once. But can you explain to me, 20 years ago, we spent a good amount of money and put up a really good police station, and I get technology and some of that stuff. But what are you doing in this plan to ensure that if we're making this kind of a structural investment, that we're not going to be sitting here 5 or 7 years from then going, well, this unistructure that houses all this stuff wasn't really built very well. So I'm really sort of wrestling with the huge investment we made not even 25 years ago and how we're being told it's not adequate, and looking at this, which is very much 1.5 to 2 times the cost, and concerned because I think you took 37,000 square feet and took away 1 fire station and then added, sort of split it into 2. So I'm just wondering if you could just highlight maybe a few points that makes this idea a lot better than the last one.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think one of the main points for that, and I want to walk it carefully because I don't want to disparage the decisions of the past or anything like that, but that facility didn't go through the rigor of, from what I understand, the rigor of the process through an architect that is an expert in designing police facilities, as they have this time around. There are not just functional issues with that building as it stands currently. When was the last time you had a passing Department of Public Health inspection on the cells, right? It just doesn't meet the standards of today's police station. And it's not just the actual building itself and the design of it, but the site. It really locks in that, I mean, currently they're parking across the street and using other facilities to store vehicles because they're beyond the capacity of the 42 parking spaces that are on site right now. What we're doing is when we design a police station or a fire station, we don't design it for 10, 20, 30 years. We make sure when we're having these programming conversations that we're talking about what the future of the department is in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and then also backing that up with data and analyzing demographic data, calls for service, arrest records. And we're looking at the full gambit of the past 30, 40 years of the police department and fire department's activities to make sure that it's correlating with the data that's going into that program so that we can extrapolate that out and say, if they were here then, they're here now, growth is continuing, we can anticipate reasonably that they'll be here then. But then not building everything all at once. I had mentioned that on the rooftop, there were a couple of areas where there were some spaces that had outdoor amenities for both departments. Those are being designed so that they can support future interior environments just by adding some walls and extending the roof without really changing or modifying the structure or creating an addition outside of the building footprint. So that way, in 20 years, if we were like, wow, they really shot up and there was a ton of growth in the department and we're just out of space already, the building itself is designed such that it can accommodate it, and the property itself has additional space that the ones that they have now, except for Station 2, obviously, because that's what we're talking about, the headquarters and the police department just don't have available to allow for that growth.
Todd Lemon, Chief of Police. So Mr. Jones asked a question that, it's a great question. So my comments is going to show how old I am. When I first came to Auburn, we moved into that building next to Cason and Foster, across the street from Sears. It was a great location. It was a good spot for us. But that was a 20-year building, and that building was scaled down. And my predecessors tell me that the builder that built that building approached the town after the initial proposals came forward and said, for a few $1,000s more, we can build a second story on that building. And that was declined by the town, so they didn't do it. So that building was in the rearview mirror. It was a 20-year-old building. This building that we're currently in on Oxford Street, the chief at the time, Ron Miller, someone I admire greatly, he brought this to the town hoping that for the amount of money that we could sell that Selfridge Street property for, we would be able to build a police station. We weren't able to do that. But they did build it for $2 million. We had about 17 police officers at the time. We've virtually more than doubled in size since then, and I've had my eyes wide open on this. So I've had the opportunity with other members of my staff and the fire department to tour other facilities. I can tell you I went to one in Worcester County. It was a beautiful facility. We looked at it about 4 months ago. It was an all concrete and block facility. It was architecturally, it was very attractive, and I met with the police chief and said, did you design a 50-year building? And he said, well, I believe so. And I said, well, how many offices do you have? And he told me. And I said, how many extra lockers do you have for 50 years in the future? And this is a Metro West community. They built it with 2 extra lockers. So I guess my point is that we understand, the fire chief and myself, I'm not going to grandstand. This is a need for the town and the department, whether it happens now or it happens in the future with other chiefs. We believe that this project that was designed, there was a lot of time that was put into this since 2018. We had sincerely hoped that we were able to get the perfect property in the center of Auburn. We even looked at other properties that Matt didn't talk about. We looked at the water department and over where the driving range is, but there's aquifers over there that were problematic. But we just would encourage the community and the town and the residents to not be short-sighted, that we can't make the same mistakes and scale back with any of the facilities, whether it be schools, DPW. We have to build for the future so we don't repeat our mistakes that happened with the last two buildings.
Have there been discussions about value engineering or anything? And one of my concerns is $500,000 for covered parking. Are there areas that you guys have looked to scale back or other concerns? I mean, obviously, we were looking at somewhere closer to 50 million. Costs have increased. Has there been discussions about reducing some of the stuff or holding off on some of the equipment and stuff that was designed?
I'll lead it off, but I think you guys might add to it a little bit. I think the feasibility study committee, as well as the chiefs, have been pretty rigorous in their sort of value engineering throughout the process. Seems like every few months, they call me up, we have a meeting, we take a look at the program one more time with fresh eyes and see where we can trim, what spaces we can live without for now, and what spaces need to be modified or reduced down. So I think it's sort of hard to illustrate that process right now to you all here, but I think both departments have been extremely responsible in making sure that they're not reaching for the stars, so to speak, and we have revisited it time and time again to make sure that it's really as trimmed down and as slim as it can be. That said, this was a pretty initial schematic design for the site with the program to show feasibility, to get the cost and budget together. I know that I can also, further make this floor plan and layout more efficient to save space. We can always trim 5% out of a building footprint without having much effect on the program. And will, as the architect, will continue to do so in collaboration with the departments. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to both of those, but.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Chief Steve Coleman, Fire Rescue. Thanks for those comments, Matt. And Steve, it's a great question. And really what it comes down to is that we've been at this for 5 years. It's seen many reiterations. I think that not only the chief and I, the administrative staff, even conversations that we had early on with Kevin Kennedy and his committee, those were all things that were talked about to make sure that we're not, sort of like shooting for that moon, right? And I can remember something that Kevin Kennedy said very early on is that, there's a wants and a need, list. And I think that everybody has really gone onto this project worrying about what the needs are. Again, as Chief Lemon said, much like the fire department in 1964 when fire headquarters opened, that building was not designed with any full-time staff in mind. There was not one full-time firefighter that worked in the building at the time in 1964. The building opened without a woman's room. It didn't open with a woman's locker room. The building opened with one office. There was a fire chief's office. That was it. So what we're trying to do now is we're trying to not only fit the needs of today, but we're trying to do what in some respects, right, and we get it. We understand that there's always room to sharpen the pencil. We understand that. But when we look at projects, and I have a similar story at fire headquarters, when you're looking at the Drury Square Fire Station from the street, you'll notice that we have a second floor addition that's only on the left side of the building. There's not an addition above the apparatus floor. And the reason is, and these are first-hand account stories that I've heard from members who were there at the time, the fire chief, or a previous fire chief who was a firefighter at the time, they approached the town and they said, similar story, for a few $1,000s, we can upgrade the steel roof structure in this that would allow you to carry a second floor addition in the future. And the town declined that. And we're living with that decision now where, 50 years later, we're not utilizing several thousand square feet of the building because we're not able to go up. In hindsight, I get why those decisions may have been made at the time, because there's probably sticker shock, and we're always trying to sharpen the pencil and keep things tight. I understand that. But I think 50 years later, it's easy to sit here and say it was probably a short-sighted decision. You know, much like, you know, with the police station, there were several cuts that were made to the building before they even moved in that made the building that much more sort of challenging on the day they moved in because of the cuts. So we have done the value engineering in the sense of, and if you look at the plans, you know, behind there, every single space that is in that building is a space that is part of the current operation of the departments today. There's not one space in there that's not designed for something that's going on today. But we're also trying to be responsible in the sense of trying to forecast what's going to happen in the next 50 years is almost impossible, even 20. You know, both of our departments over the last 20 to 25 years, they've more than doubled in size. Our call volume has exploded by 500, 600%. No one could have predicted 25 years ago, I think, what these departments would look like today in terms of their operations. But we're trying to at least say, we're trying to forecast a little bit and trying not to cut really what's going to put us potentially back here in another 20 years to say, if only in 2023 we didn't sharpen the pencil so much that it really sort of boxed us into a situation. So I think even the design that Matt was talking about, where we're trying to be really creative with sort of some exterior spaces that have the ability to be closed in 20 or 30 years, that gains us much needed square footage without changing a footprint. Those to me are very sort of unique and, you know, things that are kind of looking towards the future. But, you know, on the fire side, we built out the administration side with 2 spare offices. You know, so essentially what we're saying is, in the next 20 to 25 years, are we gonna, you know, again, we didn't build it out with 6 spare offices. We're trying to be reasonable to say, in the next 20 to 25 years, is it possible that there may be 1 or 2 people that are there that are not here today? I think that's completely reasonable. So I think when you look at the building, I think we've done a very good job of sharpening the pencil already. As Matt said, there's ways that we can trim square footage that really don't affect the operation. I think our biggest concerns is scaling it down to a point where it affects the operation on the day we move in. At that point, it almost makes spending the $78 million almost not worth it. If operationally, the day we're gonna move in, we have some of the same challenges that we're gonna have to deal with moving forward.
So that outdoor space on the second floor, is it needed? I understand for future growth you can build, but if you didn't do that, is there savings there and they can meet outside like they currently do? So if you're gonna be building, I'm assuming you need outdoor paving materials. It looked nice in the rendering. I'm assuming plantings and such. So again, I haven't seen the whole design. I'm just saying, when I see that, I understand the growth and the potential, and I don't want to get stuck there. But again, the cost, and you didn't speak to the covered parking for $500,000. Is that a need?
That's a police, I'll let the chief speak to that. But just to your point, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but that outdoor space, that's the roof of an existing facility. So even if that outdoor space doesn't exist, that's the roof of something on the first floor.
Yeah.
Again, you're not just walking out onto a roof, so there's additional work that needs to get done.
Yeah, there is, but in terms of the overall project budget, you know, we're talking thousands of dollars of savings, not millions of dollars of savings to pull that back.
Okay, thank you.
Ed Coleman, Finance Committee. I just had a quick question. As part of the project, is it also including the future use of the properties that will be shut down? Would they become assets to be sold or held for future use? I'm just thinking of the maintenance cost if we have 2 vacant buildings.
Thank you, Charlie. Eddie, that's a good question. So the intent was to program the existing police station into a school admin building. And we understand that's going to need some modifications. And certainly that cost has not been included in this 7A. So I think this is part of what we need to also discuss tonight. In terms of headquarters, that's going to remain as an now becomes a substation of the fire department, because where this proposed joint public safety facility is designed for, it's going to impact, if they were to close down headquarters, it would impact the response time on that side of town. So the intent is to maintain headquarters as a substation, and this facility would allow for response time on the west side of town.
I think the project would probably take 7 years before it'd be ready to go, well, in terms of actually opening. So we'd probably need that substation for quite a while, until they can actually open the new station.
I guess in terms of a timeline from now until when this facility could conceivably open, if this was to go to town meeting, pass debt override in June, July, whatever, and then we move right into design and then construction, I would anticipate this facility would be able to be completed in about 3.5 years in a linear timeline. It takes about a year for us to put the bid documents together and get it on the street. And one of this size with the site and having to do a demolition would be a couple more years. Now, the only caveat to that is if there's an enabling project to get school administration out somewhere, that would certainly impact the timeline, but a project this size, just as a standalone, about 3 years.
Great, thank you.
Patrick Jones, Finance Committee. So can you tell me if this takes in the time value of money? So is this $80,000 5 years from now, or is this $80,000 today and it's going to grow because we're not going to finish for 5 years?
That's a great question. The estimate that we had provided is, just want to pull up the timeline. The cost itself is escalated to the anticipated midpoint of construction should this proceed in a linear path. So that puts the midpoint of construction in March of 2025. So of that cost, about 10% of that is just the increase of the value of construction over the next 2 years.
Yes.
Gail Holloway, Auburn School Committee. I've lived in Auburn all my life, taught in Auburn all my life, and I just have one concern. I love what the police and the fire department want and need, and they should get what they want and need, but Randall School to the school committee is more than just an office space for our superintendent. There's classrooms there, there's children that come there. We can't just pick them up and say, okay, here's your new desk to our superintendent, and everything's going to be all just wonderful, because there's a whole program involved at Randall School for our older children. And I mean, I've been there in the spring and the summer, and they're using the grounds outside to plant and learn about things like that. So, I mean, we need to make, if we're going to move the school offices out of there, we need to make a firm commitment to a program for them so that that can continue. Because we need more than desk space. We need places for our students, too.
Seeing nobody then, Mr. Kazanovich, I think is going to talk about money. Am I right, Ed?
That's correct.
Good. Go ahead, sure.
So what I've provided to each and every one of you are 2 of these spreadsheets. And what I'm displaying is what you have in hard copy. And I laid out, through consultation with our financial advisor, laid out two scenarios based upon a cost estimate that has been provided to you of 78 million and change. So the first one we're going to look at is a debt schedule, a level debt schedule of a period of 20 years. And like Matt has indicated to you in terms of an escalation of costs on the construction side, we're seeing an escalation of costs on interest we're paying on our long-term debt. And it's been pretty significant. I can tell you back a couple of years ago, we were getting rates, a net interest cost rate of approximately 2% on the debt that we were going out and borrowing. Today's interest rate is a result of 9 increases by the feds over the course of the last year and a half, has resulted in a current rate of about 4.75 to 5%, and that's what these schedules reflect. And as a result of that increase, I can tell you that we're paying much more in interest costs, probably $20 to $25 million, in addition to what we would have paid a couple of years ago. So the first schedule, this is a 20-year schedule. And I just want to draw your attention to the high school debt here, which is falling off. Our last payment is in 2024. As you can see, we retired the debt. And as a result of retiring that debt, a house worth, and these schedules are based upon a median average house value of $363,000. That's the value of the current year that we're in. The retirement of the high school debt would save approximately a house valued at $363,000, about $160. So if we weren't going forward with the public safety facility, your taxes would come down by a value of about an average of $160. When we look at the debt on a project of $78,500,000 at a blended rate of about 4.75%, when you look at the schedule, it's highlighted in blue at the bottom. Okay, the large block area at the bottom. Right here. This is the debt we would be paying on the $78,500,000. So as you can see in year one, because of the cash flow, we wouldn't have to borrow that much money, but it accelerates and levels off as we get into year 2 and 3. So we wouldn't borrow the full $78,500,000 up front. We would structure it in such a way to meet our cash flow needs based upon the duration and the length of the construction project. But as you can see, once those full value of that borrowing is incurred, we're looking at annual debt payments of roughly $6,080,000. That would have an impact of about $2.13 per $1,000 of value. And for a house valued at $363,000, the average median value, it would be a tax increase of $773 per year at a 20-year schedule. Now, if you want to calculate the value of your home, what's it going to be on your home if your home is valued less or more? You take the value of your home, say it's $500,000, divide it by 1,000, that's 500, multiply it by 2.13, and that's what estimated tax payment would be. So the total debt and interest for a project of $78,500,000 over a 20-year period, when you calculate what you're borrowing and the total interest paid, you're paying about $125 million over 20 years. Any questions on the 20-year schedule before I move on to the 30 year? As a matter of accounting principle, you always want to try to pay off your debt in the shortest amount of time to minimize the level of interest you're paying. The longer the term, the more interest you're going to pay. And I'll show you that on the 30-year schedule, although the annual impact is less, but we're paying more because we're paying interest for another 10 years. On the 30-year schedule, as you can see, once again, year one, we're not borrowing the full amount, it's less, but now we're leveling off at a value of about 4.9 million instead of 6 million. So the impact at a level debt service of 4,900,000 would result in a tax increase of about $1.72 per $1,000 of value. So for a house valued at $363,000, that would be roughly $625. Now, the total value of debt and interest on a 30-year schedule, although the monthly or the annual increase is less, we're paying about $150 million on a $78,500,000 project instead of the $125 million. So we're actually paying $25 million more by going out an additional 10 years. So it's pretty significant. Now, these rates were calculated based upon our current bond rating, which is an A2. There's no reason to believe that our bond rating would be downgraded, and there's no reason to believe that our bond rating would be upgraded. We believe that we would maintain an A2. And every time we go out and borrow, whether it's for a project of this value or whether it's something to meet our annual capital needs, we have to go for a bond rating review. And typically, we do that every 2 years. So that's a summary of the debt impact that would result of a project of this magnitude. I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time if anyone should have any.
Megan McCurless, School Committee. So this increase would be for the next 20 years, that somebody would see this in their taxes, correct?
Yeah, what you're looking at on that schedule is
20.
depicts a house valued at $363,000.
Yep. Okay. So, because my concern, of course, is the schools and where our schools are right now. So I'm thinking, you know, if Percy Place goes in, if the other one goes in, where are we putting our kids? It's, you know, my concern.
So I just want to say a project of this magnitude, although because we have excess levy capacity, we could fund this through the operational side of the budget. But the residents and the voters of this community should have a say as to whether or not this project, whether they want the project or whether they want this project to go forward. So it would require a debt exclusion vote, which would be by ballot question. And then town meeting would have to vote an authorization to go out and borrow the money. So there are 2 hurdles that would have to be cleared. And so that's why we're having this discussion, because there is a process that we would have to follow. And whether or not, you know, it's done quickly or whether it's done in a targeted date that we discussed, that decision remains to be made.
Scott Wren, Chair of the Board of Selectmen. This debt, in terms of the borrowing rate, is it safe to say that this debt can be refinanced over time should we see rates decrease?
That's a great question. Certainly, we would have a callable, they call it a callable provision on our bonds. Typically, on a 20-year schedule, that's done between years 8 and 10. We actually refinanced the high school debt in year 8 and saved the taxpayers $3 million. So absolutely. I think at some point, we're going to see the rates come back. I don't see that in the short term. Quite honestly, I see it maybe going up a little bit in order to bring inflation under control. But certainly, I think looking out maybe into the fall, a year from now, I think you may see a retreat of the rates.
Are there operating costs, say, Steve Chambers, Select Board? Are there operating costs that would be realized once this is operational and something the taxpayers could see help reduce the overall budget?
So I know there are some efficiencies as a result of new construction. I can tell you, and I know Chief Todd Lemon can tell you that the HVAC alone over on Oxford Street has cost the taxpayers thousands of dollars a year. It's inadequate. It's constantly breaking down. We're actually doing a study through the use of opera funds that may result in some upgrades to HVAC systems that are not efficient through the entire town. I think that engineering study is due to come in within the next 30 to 60 days. That may result in a request before the board. Whether this facility is built, if it is built, we still need to do those upgrades because that building is going to house a town operations in some fashion. So, but in terms of other costs, we haven't examined that yet. But I think, you know, when you look at it, whether it's a new middle school or new high school, typically the operational expenses, there are some efficiencies, but operational expenses typically go up.
Sarah Ruffley, Vice Chair of the Select Board. Can you tell me when the middle school falls off of the debt?
I believe the middle school was a 20-year purpose as well. I think we're into year 6 or 7 of the middle school. So we have about 13 years left.
Yes.
Mike Marshall, I think this is on. Mike Marshall, Finance Committee. I have 2 questions. These projections are based on the current tax base, right? So future development in town will obviously increase our tax base, which will also theoretically decrease the burden on every individual taxpayer. Can you just confirm that that's right?
That is correct. This is basically a snapshot in time, so.
100%.
It's based upon our current assessed value.
Yep.
So if there is some growth that, on the commercial industrial sector, it will result in a reduction in residential taxation.
And then, unrelated to that, has the town explored the costs of renovating these buildings to get them even to like a baseline where we feel like they're operational? And how does that compare? Because I think one of the big issues that everybody has is the sticker shock of $78 million, but there is a cost associated with not doing this, and that's the cost of repairing crumbling infrastructure and dealing with buildings that just don't work. And it is difficult when we don't have a number like that to compare it. And I think a lot of people's concern is we're looking at it like $78 million versus $0, and that is absolutely not how this works. And so I just, if we haven't done that, I think we're doing a disservice to the taxpayers before we make these presentations. And if you do have some of those numbers, understanding what the actual difference is between having an operational fire and police department in the buildings that exist now versus an operational fire and police departments in a new facility is going to be hugely helpful in selling this to the town. I am super supportive of this project, but I think that there's a lot of hesitance because people don't everyone's just saying we're going to spend $78 million, and it's not an either or. We're going to spend money either way, a lot of it, and it's either $78 million now or it's $90 million in 10 years, or it's $20 million now to repair buildings that are crumbling, and then another 78 in 10 years when we still have to do this project. So I just, if we haven't done this, and I understand that we did some feasibility studies, but like having an understanding of what those feasibility studies actually showed would be super helpful.
Mr. Marshall, that's a great comment and question. I don't have a value for that. I know Matt alluded to that in his presentation when they considered a rehab of each facility. But the problem is the restriction on the growth aspect. So you can't go up on the fire department. There are limitations there, so I don't know how you can put a value to a facility that you can't expand to accommodate the needs and the operational requirements that currently exist.
As an alternative, I think understanding what the cost of not doing anything would be. So are there funds that we no longer have access to from a government perspective because we have facilities that don't pass code, like we can't get a Board of Health inspection to pass? Are there like fees or fines that we're paying because we don't have facilities that meet standards that we're supposed to have? Are we having issues with recruitment? Are we having issues with retention because people are going to other towns where they're not going to work in a retrofitted gymnasium? Like, these are the things, like, and I'm sorry that I'm getting a little worked up about this all, but like, I want this project to pass desperately because our infrastructure sucks. And I am worried that it's not going to because we are not selling it correctly. And having the fire chief and police chief explain the limitations of the current facilities is helpful, but putting a dollar cost on that is what is going to get through to the people who are just seeing $78 million. And I don't know how we do that. I am not an accountant, nor am I an architect, or any of these, the things that would be helpful in this particular scenario. But I am really worried that this is not going to move forward because we're not communicating the real limitations and the costs associated with not doing it well.
Mr. Chairman? Moderator? Mr. Moderator?
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve.
That's okay. Thank you. I just want to talk a couple of quick points. Much like you, I don't know the answer. I don't know how to do that either, right? Because I can't honestly sit here right now and tell you that by not doing something, well, I can tell you that by not doing something, we're not paying fines. I'm not dealing with OSHA, inspect, those kind of things. Just to kind of put a little historical perspective on the renovation thing, the struggle that we have at fire headquarters is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Chief Roger Belhumer attempted to do a renovation of the headquarters property. And there were a couple of limitations. One, with funding. The town did not want to spend the money on an expansion. And second, because we're in the FEMA floodway, anything that expanded the existing footprint of that building was going to put us at risk of the town as a whole, not just the fire department, unable to receive federal dollars. So that's the issue at headquarters. The issue at West Street is a whole nother, can of worms. In 1985, when the fire station opened at West Street, that opened under the premise that this is a temporary fix, which is why we're not going to invest any capital money into converting the elementary school into a fire station. They spent $80,000 to put the 3 bay doors in the front of the building, and then that was it. They called it quits. There was no other renovation to the building to turn it into a fire station because it was a temporary situation. The temporary situation then turned into, well, we're not going to spend any money in renovation because for 40 years, the reason has been, we don't know what the future of that building is going to be. And then, we talk about, well, we don't want to spend a lot of money because we're going to build a high school. In 1985, again, in the late 80s, they were on the venture to build a new high school in the late 80s. And we couldn't do anything in terms of building a fire station because the high school was coming. And then, fast forward 20 years, we get the high school. And then after the high school was purchased, then Chief Wynot went to the Board of Selectmen in late 2000s and said, can we put an exploratory committee together to look at the fire station? And it was, well, we just built the high school. So we were told then, Nothing is going to happen as far as construction of a fire station until the high school is paid off. 20 years. That was said from day one. So, okay, so we wait 20 years. Now, in the middle of there, you know, fortunately through MSBA, we were able to build a middle school. And so now, you know, we find ourselves where here we are, not only 20 years after the high school, but 40 years after 1985 when we originally moved in there. 37, close to 40. And it's, you know, again, the problem with that building from a renovation standpoint is we're not renovating a fire station. We're renovating an elementary school. And, you know, there's trucks that I have in the fleet, like our tanker truck, engine 2, carries 2,500 gallons of water. That truck really should be in the West End, because the West End is the area of town that doesn't, in some areas, isn't supplied by municipal water. That tanker truck won't fit in the building. It doesn't have the depth. So even if you renovate the building, you're still only renovating it within the footprint than it is. And again, you're renovating a building that was never designed to do that. You know, the EMS coordinator, his office is the old main office. The 1950-something bell clock is still in the wall, you know. So renovation, and I think Matt would tell you the same thing, the money that you would spend on a renovation is going to be in the millions, and it's still not going to get us where we need to be. And again, I agree with you. I have a concern that this project isn't going to pass either. And listen, you know, the chief and I have both said there's sticker shock all around. You know, it took 3 minutes of all of us, I think, staring at each other for a little while because it came in $28 million more than we had anticipated. That's not lost on anyone. But I have a concern as well that, you know, close to 40 years, West Street is my major concern. And to answer your question, I'm not going to get into the devil of the details with this tonight. But the short answer to your question is, yes, I do have morale issues because of the West Street Fire Station. And those are things that we have to deal with on a daily basis. People don't necessarily bid to go there. They're told to go there, you know. So that is a factor. But I'm concerned that if this project doesn't pass, there are other needs in the town. And again, it's recognized that we do need new elementary schools. We do need other things. But we're also sharing one big pot of money. And in some respects, we've been waiting since 1985 to address the issue. And if this sort of loses steam over the next couple of years, another municipal project is going to be done, and then whoever the fire chief is at that time is going to be told, we can't even think about that until that's paid off in another 20 years. And that's my concern. So, you know, there's a lot to talk about. I'm glad, you know, this is I think, just one initial, you know, step in this process. You know, something needs to be done to fix conditions. What that is from, you know, here to here, that's all debatable. It's up for discussion. There's probably other iterations of this project that could be done to reduce it. You know, I think anything is on the table, but I agree with you 100%. Doing nothing is not an option. And if the taxpayers are concerned about money, this is only going to cost the taxpayers more by doing nothing.
Yes.
Pullman Finance Committee. I just sold myself on it. It's kind of another way of looking at the cost. So if I look at the cost that Ed said, that's half of what I spend at Dunkin' Donuts every year. So a cup of coffee, we can get a new public safety building. And that's the $600 and something a year, that's at today's money. So if it's a 20-year mortgage, that $624 stays the same, right? So in 10 years, 20 years, it'll still be $600, and it's not the same as it is today.
Yes.
Dan Carpenter, Select Board. So building on Mr. Marshall's point, and I know I brought this up in the process, is we have 2 buildings that need to be addressed. And I'm just hearing about the school committee needing more space than just office space. So this isn't the end of the road. So not having that answer, so as we're sitting in the brand-new high school, I remember well when the first proposal was, they were going to renovate the existing high school, that was going to become the middle school, and they were going to build a new high school, and it got voted down because people were like, well, if you can make the high school perfect, why would you need to build a new one? Not thinking that you needed 2 new buildings. They didn't get that. So my concern, in addition to the sticker shock, which, also with the fact that our taxes have gone up exponentially since 2008. And there are real concerns, from at least me, that we have residents now that are having difficulty meeting their obligations. So I don't think that they're approaching it from the perspective of, this isn't a need, this isn't something that they want to do. It's not everybody's going to Dunkin' Donuts and buying coffee. Some people can't afford that. So it isn't something that we can just say, hey, because this is going to go up $700. That's on top of all the other increases that they're going to see. So it's not a $700 hit, and that's the end of the story. It's the $700 hit plus whatever needs. So I don't think that there isn't support in the community for it, or that there isn't support for building staffing. I think people are just looking at it and saying, how can I afford it and still stay in my home and keep my home safe? Because I think that's a real subject that all of you on that side of the table in uniforms have to deal with every day, going into homes and not knowing, is it safe for me to step here? What am I going to come into? So, I do think that it's a concern. I share the concern because our average tax bill is almost at $6,000. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. And if you're on a limited income or you're on a lower middle income, you're not making $6,000 a month. And that's on top of water expenses, that's on top of sewer expenses, and everything else going up. So my concern is we don't have that. What's going to happen to these other 2 buildings? We know that something's going to happen, but what is a time frame and how much is it going to cost? Because if the costs are going to go up here, us not knowing that cost is also going to affect. So I think that's going to be a question that you're going to get.
Yes.
I'll defer to the superintendent.
Oh, thank you. Beth Chamberlain, school superintendent. So I, too, would love to see these folks get what they need. My husband was a longtime firefighter. My father was a police officer. And we have certainly benefited in the school department by these beautiful buildings, as you can witness here today, right? And that's because of the support that we've gotten from the townspeople. So I want that out there first and foremost. But this does pose some challenges ahead for us I was thinking 2 years. Tonight I heard 3.5 years before that building is up. So that would be an amount of time that we need to go someplace. And we do have a program for students in our building. Students who with special needs are 18 to 22 years old. They're building transitional skills, so they go out in the community, they learn how to make a grocery list and to shop, and this is required support that we have to give these children from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And this is also a program we're hoping to build in the coming years, because there are other districts who don't have these programs who could tuition their kids into us. And right now, our program is running wonderfully. We have 5 students and 3 staff members. And so along with the 9 folks that are just office folks like myself that are in our building. So we all have to go someplace for, I think, more than 3.5 years, because in looking at the police department, it's a building that seemingly we can make work, but it's going to require some work. We're not going to be able to just move into the current police department. Particularly when we look to support this group of students. That's always what we look at first, is our kids. And so there's going to be some work there, and I just want folks to know that, right? That we have to go someplace for probably more like 4.5, maybe 5 years. That's going to have to be functional for us to then transition to the current police department. So I want people to know that. I also want folks to think about, and I know this is consideration, but something we'll want more information on is related to traffic in that area, because our middle school is there, as well as supportive. We have a lot of kids that walk to school. It's busy now as it is, but nothing that I don't think can be figured out, right? So I'm not saying it's not doable. We just need some really in-depth discussions about how that would impact our students. And so, you know, that's where we sit. We want to support, we support them, as I said. We've been the beneficiaries of this. But there are some things that go along with it in order for us to move out of the old Randall building that, you know, serves us pretty well. So that's it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Kevin Kennedy with the Finance Committee. I was also the chair of the Public Safety Facilities Committee that was made up, comprised of police and fire representatives as well as members of the community, and we met since 2018. I can't believe it's been this long, but just to give a quick summary as to the community aspect that we did look at this, and it kind of goes to what Michael said relative to the needs. So, you know, we kind of went in, I went in with a degree of skepticism, but certainly after touring the buildings and seeing the buildings and talking to the staff and seeing exactly what was going on, it was clear that there was, I'll say for the police station, there was a need. I'll say for the Auburn Street site, there was somewhere between a need and necessity. The West Street site, to Michael's point, an absolute necessity. I think I cringe every time the fire department or someone comes to us before finance because something else at that building is failing. A wall, they've discovered something uber-duper bad stuff behind a wall or up in a ceiling. To put more money into that building, I cringe at it because it's not there. Matt from Tecton mentioned the cost of the fire apparatus that's sitting on a floor that I didn't realize too long ago. There's a crawl space under it. I'm waiting for that call that one of those fire trucks doesn't end up 3 feet down in that basement. That building is an absolute necessity. Back to the committee, so we looked at these buildings, really made the determination that there was a significant need for and we determined a combined public safety facility. And that was based on everything that Matt had mentioned, cost savings, efficiencies, and we said, okay, now we figure our next step, it was gonna be easy, we'll go out and identify a site. And looked at some sites, and there was some, we had preferences over, but in the end, nobody wanted to sell us any land, and we didn't own any land. The Lowe's site, administration may not be able to say, but the rumor we heard on the street was it was valued at, I was gonna make this up, $7 million, but the property owner was saying he thought he could get $12 million for it. So there was a significant cost there. Simon Properties must have bigger ideas for their sites because they took out paperwork at one point, but never came back that they had any interest in selling their properties. The Shaw's property, the Tecton laid it out towards the back. We probably could have discussed where it was laid out on the property, but ultimately, they weren't willing to sell. So we didn't have any property. That's what it came down to, and that's what it took a long time. At our insistence, we went back out for another request to see if maybe the times had changed, maybe commercial real estate, things had changed in the market. Nobody wanted to sell us any property. So, the West Street site, we own the land. We can move forward. Everything else we were told through town administration, land acquisitions, going to court, that eminent domain was going to be a lengthy and a costly process that in the end we could get the land and then get to this process and not get approval. So we could own spend $2 million in legal fees, get it for the market rate at $5 million and have $7 million expended and still not have approval to put a facility up. So that's basically all I wanted to get into, that that necessity is there, I believe, for that West Street station. We're going to have to do something with that soon. That's not going away. There's definitely certain, Mike, you mentioned that, in those costs, or what do we see? We're not seeing fines, but, there is some pretty significant data coming out of the fire services, relative to, cancer, and at some point where that's been presented that, these firefighters are sort of commingling stuff they're bringing back with them from fires on fire apparatus, fire equipment, the drying gear. These guys eventually, God forbid someone gets cancer, they're going to point to that and point to there's going to be, I believe, I'll speak to the attorneys in the room, but there may be some liability for the community relative to not providing some protections for those folks. So I think there is going to be some costs down the road if we don't make some addressing of it. Like everybody else, this was sticker shock. And I guess my one question, if Matt gets back up with some questions, is you're obviously throughout New England and probably beyond presenting similar proposals to communities, how are they getting beyond the sticker shock? I mean, we can't be alone at this. I don't know if it's the right time, Mr. Moderator, to speak to that, but
Sure.
It's a great question, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one to answer, and I can't answer it other than some are either just going to bite the bullet and just say we recognize it's not going to get any cheaper, and let's make it as efficient as we possibly can right now, and just get it done. And others, the projects are just gonna die in the vine, and it's gonna wait until the next 20 years to come through a cycle again and get done. So, you know, if there is the appetite and the aptitude to sort of do something now, communities around the country are either realizing that it is the right time and they're jumping at it and trying to accelerate it as quickly as possible to mitigate as much of those costs, or they put it to bed and see what happens at the next administration 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So we've seen with that as an understanding, we've actually seen more projects successfully pass through town meetings and approvals over the past 2 years than we have 5 years ago. Back then, we sort of had that, after the recession, we don't want to increase the taxes on anybody. We still had that sort of feeling in a lot of communities, but now there's sort of more of a race to get it at the best price that we possibly can.
Yes.
Hi, Megan McCurl, School Committee. I know we have the three options, and it sounds like the West Street option is the worst as of right now, which I support the whole thing if we truly need it. Have we done any research on for now, looking at West Street? That's my first question. My second question is, so we talked a lot about like what the residents are going to be giving for this project. How about commercial? What's the commercial percentage that they'll be giving?
As Ed comes up, I'll answer the first part. We've not done a specific site test fit and design for sort of just, I think what you're getting is like, let's just do fire headquarters at West Street as a standalone fire station. We did some initial studies way back at the beginning of the project, but we never, because the recommendation and the understanding was the most efficient and cost-effective plan was the joint public safety facility. It was studied like it was as that on the West Street site. Having said that, the way that we organized the building with sort of a wing of the fire department administration and living quarters and a wing of the police department with a connector in the middle of those community and public spaces, it's conceivable that it'd be really reasonable to sort of do it as a phased project where today we do a fire station, tomorrow we do a police department. I can't tell you what the difference in cost would be one way or the other, because I think we need to work together to determine where that dividing line is, how much of the community space do you build now, and where does that end? So I think, we could certainly study it, come back with a cost and an understanding of what that would be. I would anticipate it's probably, it's probably going to be a little bit more than half of what we're looking at now.
Yeah, I just know that right now, like when 2018, I think our economy was a lot different than it is now, and people are really struggling. So my just thought is to get the town to vote it, if we looked at doing something like that. I don't know. I don't work in finance though, so.
From the Finance Committee? Yes.
Wait, there was a.
No, sorry, I wanted to answer Megan's question.
Oh,
So,
okay, I'm sorry.
Megan, I do not have the analysis on the commercial industrial aspect, but we could compute it based upon the gap in the tax rate as it exists right now and come up with something similar. So although their average value, I think, is approaching $1 million when you look at the commercial industrial. So their level of taxation is going to be much more significant than what you're seeing on the residential side. But I don't have that number available tonight.
Thank you. I had Ann Kavanaugh, Finance Committee. You had mentioned a $50,000 price for the project. What year was that? And also, what would you estimate the cost for the project to be in, say, 10 years?
Yeah, one of the early slides had talked about what some of the initial project costs we were looking at, of the $50 million, when I think that was late 2018, early 2019 is when we were looking at that value. As far as, so I think a good rule of thumb that you could sort of use, I'm not going to snap to a number quite yet because I'm not good at compounding interest in my head. Right now, I would say now to 3 years ago, we've been seeing in the range of 20 to 30% escalation year over year. On an average annual basis, what we would see in a normal economy, we would be looking at more like 6% year over year. So I think if you see inflation come down, you see sort of construction slow down, and you see us return to sort of a normal market condition, you could expect 6% year over year. And that's tied to sort of an average 2% inflation rate in CPI.
Patrick Jones, Finance Committee. To the town manager, if we put this to the public to vote, will they vote on whether if they were to just accept it or not accept it, or would they determine whether they wanted a 20 or 30-year borrowing as part of that vote?
The vote would reflect whether they support the project or not. The determination on the term of the debt would be, that's a decision that is made by town administration.
Anybody else? Yes.
Kevin Kennedy, Finance. So there appears there's going to be some